Maybe a narcissistic relationship is just basically like having a relationship with a podcast. In the past few months, for a variety of reasons, I've had to spend quite a bit more time with more narcissistic folks than usual. I sincerely hope they are not watching this, but if they are, look inward. Some are people I know, some were strangers. If I have to go through these interactions, I'm not going to let the moment pass. So I figured I may as well pay attention and learn more, right? Let the suffering have a point. I noticed something, and maybe because I'm doing so much of it all at once, and I'm surprised I didn't notice it as viscerally as before. It's one thing to study it, see it in patients. It's quite a bit different to really be actively living it. And some of you may be thinking, that I'm late to the party of recognizing this. And what I've noticed is that for how much we think they're socially skilled, narcissistic people don't really have conversations. I learned this pointedly because I recently went very quickly from talking to a very narcissistic person to a sweet and lovely and interesting person very quickly one day, one conversation to the next. With the sweet, lovely, interesting person, I would say something. They would respond to the thing I said, maybe ask a follow-up question, be interested in it, react to it. Sometimes it was relevant to something that was happening in their life. But the thing I brought up linked into what they were saying, right? So I knew they heard me, okay? And then when they would bring up something, same thing, normal. The conversation flowed, we would laugh, they would listen, I would listen, they would talk, I would talk. I learned about them, they learned about me, and at the end of the experience, I'd say it was gratifying, it was nice, it filled my soul, it was like eating a satisfying meal. This happened literally on the tails of having had a conversation with a narcissistic person. They were talking about something, things that they needed, things that they wanted, something they were interested in, and then making some random, typically foolish observations or ask a question. I would answer their question. Then I'd share something about myself. Maybe I'd share something, I think I shared something relevant about myself and while answering their question. The two things were related. Once I brought myself into, they looked at me and they either didn't respond or they brought it right back to themselves. They talk. These narcissistic people, they talk. They talk about what's on the TV. They talk about what they're working on. They talk about a problem they're having. They talk about the change in the trash delivery days. They talk about the annoying neighbor. They may even ask a question, which I would answer. But basically, I realized I was a chat bot. Once they got the answer, I don't say thank you to the chat bot. Do you? I mean, sometimes I actually do say thank you to the chat bot. But there was no thank you. There was no attempt to see how I was doing or what I was doing or ask me about me. Do you ask the chatbot how they're doing? Probably not. Nothing, just not even a little. Sometimes in the series of conversations I had with this person, I'd raise something. I'd say, whew, tough day. I didn't know the traffic would be so bad through the center of town. I barely got to the store before it closed. And I was getting something for the person. There was no sense of like, wow, tell me about that. Like, oh, that's strange. Or I'm so glad you were able to get to the store in time. Instead, what I got was a long discourse about the timing of the red light in the middle of the town and that other people drive too slow and that no one should do errands at that time of day and that they always do their errands in the morning. But nothing else. No sense of my experience that I just got in there and that I even showed up a little bit war weary with the product from the store. I didn't need to be in the room for this. Because all of this hyper narcissism time in my life has happened in a brief period of time. Like I said, it's been like a bit of an experiment. I would be curious, like, would this ever come around in a meaningful way to the other person or people in the conversation? And I realized, actually, not really. I'll give you another example. I travel a lot, okay? So, for example, in one case, in one of these many narcissistic conversations I've been having, I shared something about a hotel I stayed in. Again, no follow-up, no interest, but either they would bring the conversation back to an unrelated topic, but that was relevant to them, or they would start talking about all the hotels they stay in, or they shared something about they saw on YouTube about hotels and that they feel like a hotel expert. They are not a hotel expert. Then when I really paid attention, because again, it was an experiment, so I was trying different things to see how it all worked. I offered up nothing. Nothing. I realized that for this person, I was either a chat bot. They would ask questions relevant to they themselves. They wouldn't ask me about my day or anything like that. And anything else that they said was never a question, but it was a statement that they were making about the world. Think of what a conversation is. There's a lot of built-in question, but they're making a statement. The game is on too late. Europe has better healthcare. I am using oak instead of maple. The mangoes are better from that store. What are you supposed to do with that? Okay. There was no back and forth. It was either their one-sided commentary about whatever banal thing was on their mind, or I was a chatbot. And even when I did ask them a question, there would be very little follow-up, right? Sometimes I needed the answer to the question to go on to do something. Some of these folks are people I've known for a long time. So this was not like the awkward get-to-know-you phase with someone new. But one thing that kept coming back to is that there was a tendency of the narcissistic people to make observations about the world. They sort of yammer on about their observations of the world. And usually their observations of the world are pretty sour. They're kind of like malcontented grievances. It's not like, wow, isn't it just a beautiful day today? It's things like, can you believe how they have people line up to get on this flight? Can you believe how people just take too long to give their order at the counter? I can't believe the town let them plant that ugly tree. This restaurant has gone downhill. That guy is a jerk. Are your pens in this cup clean? The self-checkout takes too long. It's like observe, observe, observe. Talk, talk, talk. And you realize that any form of a relationship with these folks really kind of devolves into a long, hellish Seinfeld episode. What can you say to that? Yeah, I can't believe it. Yeah, ugly tree. Yeah, the food sucks. Because if you were to push back and say, I don't know, the airplane people seem to be boarding group by group. It seems like a good system. Or it's going to take as long as it takes to get the food order in. Then you're going to become their new target. So we end up having to do a lot of either just listening to their ridiculous commentary, just to avoid going too far down the rabbit hole with them. This actually just happened to me yesterday. I was in a doctor's office. And I was bored. I had a long wait. So I put my timer on my watch and I was timing it. This woman came in, she was rude to the receptionist right away. In a 3-minute period, one woman managed to complain about the pens in the cup, the line, the chairs in the waiting room, that her husband wouldn't bring her coffee up from the car, that nobody ever listens to her, and that she shouldn't have to wait. 3 minutes. She managed to get all that in. My heart ached for the people in her life. There were no conversations being had. It was just commands, demands, and one-sided questions. But over time, the one-sidedness of all of this struck me. The same way I can't talk to the people on my TV. I mean, I can, and I sometimes do, but I know they're not going to answer me. It's the same thing here, except I don't expect the people on the TV to respond to me. And as I kept having these conversations, I'm in a terrible situation. So I'm like, let me just keep testing it, and it keeps happening. And I have to say, in these past few months, I've even met some new narcissistic people. The pattern stuck. They would say things, but they really were not waiting for answers. I was like someone to talk at. And nor did they really have much interest in the other people or person in the conversation. And this is yet another reason why people in narcissistic relationships feel like they are slowly losing their minds. It looks to the world like we're in a relationship. We are, after all, sitting with someone and talking to them, or so it seems. But the other person's actually not listening to us. They're not asking follow-up questions. They don't care. But they're always bringing it back to them. giving their theories, yammering on about nothing. It's as though it's to hear the sound of their own voice. And even if it is a group of people, and let's say they're in a group, a narcissistic person's in a group of people, and they really aren't interested in what is being talked about. They don't care about the topic. Maybe they can't offer anything. They will either leave or say something irrelevant to turn it back to themselves. The lack of attunement, the lack of engagement, the lack of interest, the lack of reciprocity over time, it really leaves you feeling crazy in one of these relationships, like you're in some form of cosplay. You're at a table with a person and both of your mouths are moving, but it's not a conversation, and yet other people think it is. At the end of the day, it's a fucking soliloquy. There's no other way to view it. And it is tricky because, again, we get back to that vacillation of the narcissistic relationship, right? And you'll think, yep, this is a pattern. They talk, and either you listen and you nod your head politely or you be a chatbot. And then sometimes there may be what feels like a conversation. And remember, the biggest error we make in these relationships, it's pronounced for people who are trauma bonded, but anyone in these relationships, we make the mistake of using the one normal thing that happens to erase the 100 times before that it wasn't like this. Be wary of doing that, because then you start blaming yourself. Sometimes, especially in more mild to moderate narcissistic relationships, we wonder, am I being too fussy? Am I expecting too much in this relationship? There may be enough in the relationship that isn't, if you will, completely terrible. But if you really stop and pay attention, you will recognize that, at least when it comes to communication, they are either talking at you, asking you something, and just expecting a simple answer, or bringing the conversation back to themselves. It doesn't really come back to you in a meaningful way. There is little curiosity unless it is to gaslight or diminish. Things like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Or, only a fool would stay in that hotel. How much did you pay? Interaction, by definition, interaction is back and forth or reciprocal. But for the narcissistic person, it only becomes back and forth if there's an opportunity to dominate and control. Again, for example, we see in gaslighting. So here's an example. You say, why did you tell me that we were going to be home for dinner? They said, I never said I was going to be home for dinner. You say, yes, you did. I texted you twice, and I even got the takeout you like. You told me to. They say, you hear what you want. I never said that. You always make it about yourself. You say, you're kidding me, right? Here's the text. They say, you're such a weirdo. What do? Stalk my texts so you can wave your stupid phone in my face? Maybe if you did something, you wouldn't make stalking me your full-time job. I guess, okay, so that's the conversation. One could say, well, that's a back and forth, but is it? Because that's when it is a back and forth in a narcissistic relationship, it can feel quite toxic. To not be attuned to or to be abused in a conversation that we think is a conversation, over time leaves us feeling like there is something wrong with us. But once you get the patterns and you see it, you really start to say that most narcissistic relationships feel like having to listen to a boring, random, poorly produced podcast. In some cases, it's an abusive podcast. But to realize that what I'm saying or offering or asking has little bearing on this conversation, and this sensation is isolating, and it's alienating, and it's angering, and it's unsettling. And many of us miss it. We may think, oh, I am going to practice being a good listener. That's right. Everyone's supposed to be a good listener. And listen, I'm all for being a good listener. But you can't just have it always be a one-way street of listening unless you're a therapist or in a service profession. But even people in those service professions, they need back and forth in real life. For it to always be one way in your real life, it's soul-sapping. I was at a work event a little while ago, and my narcissistic spidey senses were running high about someone, very high. A group of them were talking. I wasn't part of the group. I was doing something. I was doing some work on my computer. But I could hear their conversation. And you know me, I'm always wanting to learn stuff. So I sat back. I was curious to see how this would go down. Everyone was in a big hotel lobby. I knew some of the folks in the group, so I kind of turned my back so they didn't see me. The narcissistic person who I suspected was this way. This conversation was going on for a while, but very masterfully, they always brought it back to themselves. Remember at one point, one gal in the group said, "Oh, I just read such a great book by such and such person on this very topic." And then the narcissistic person then hijacked again and said, "Ah, yes." And then went on and on and on and on about their take on the topic. Never reflected on the book or the take of that other book or anything like that. Not one person was brought into the conversation. The one narcissistic person was holding court, and everyone else just had to sit there. The fawn response would dictate that they would just sit there. I mean, to step away from it, from the group, that brings up other fears. So it doesn't matter if it's one-on-one or if it's a narcissist with a group. Now, some of you may be saying, "Oh, I don't know, Dr. Ramani. During the early part of the relationship, they were listening. They seemed to be hanging on my every word." You also have to be careful whether or not those are dynamics like mirroring or even them trying to get data and information about you. But how long did that hanging on your every word phase last? Others of you may say, "Oh, no, Dr. Ramani, they hang on their boss's every word in responding. They're on top of those messages." Well, that's where narcissism can be quite tactical. And it can also be quite frustrating because it's not that the narcissistic person lacks the capacity to have a reciprocal conversation. But once you are deemed to be not valuable enough, well, then the podcast you're listening to stops being interactive really quickly. And that's most of their relationships. But if you can think of it that way, that I am in a relationship with, or was raised by, or friends with, what is in essence a boring podcast that thinks I'm a chatbot, it can actually help you with realistic expectations. And also undo that sense that you're the one losing your mind. But most importantly, to remind you to seek out other spaces where the conversation goes both ways. Unless you really want to listen to their random, angry ramblings. Personally, I don't recommend it. Thanks again.